March 1945. The sky over Berlin was a killing field where young men died by the hundreds, where American bombers fell like burning rain and German fighters swarmed like angry hornets defending their hive. Lieutenant Charles "Charlie" Brantley sat in the cockpit of his P-51 Mustang, tail painted blood red, the distinctive marking of the 332nd Fighter Group, and watched the formation of B-17 flying fortresses ahead of him lumber toward their target deep in the heart of Nazi Germany. The mission was simple in theory, but nearly impossible in practice. Escort the bombers to the Daimler-Benz tank factory in Berlin, protect them from the swarms of German fighters that would inevitably attack, and bring everyone home alive. Simple, except that Berlin was the most heavily defended city in Germany, protected by hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and the best pilots the Luftwaffe had left. And the distance from their base in Italy to Berlin and back was over 1,600 miles, the longest bomber escort mission anyone had ever attempted. Charlie gripped the stick of his Mustang and felt the familiar mixture of fear and excitement that came before combat. The knowledge that in the next few hours he would either prove himself once again or die trying. He was one of the Tuskegee Airmen, the first African-American military pilots in United States history. Men who had fought not just the Germans, but their own country's racism and prejudice to earn the right to fly and fight. Every mission was a chance to prove the doubters wrong, to show that black pilots were just as skilled and brave as any white pilot. And Charlie had never backed down from a challenge in his life. The formation crossed into German airspace, and immediately the radio chatter increased as spotters on the ground reported their position, and German fighters scrambled to intercept. Charlie scanned the sky constantly, his eyes moving in the pattern he'd been taught, checking 6 o'clock, 12 o'clock, high and low, looking for the telltale glint of metal on sunlight that meant enemy fighters approaching. The bombers droned on, steady and slow, sitting ducks for any fighter that got through the escort screen. And Charlie knew that every man in every bomber was depending on him and his fellow redtails to keep them alive. The first attack came without warning, as a dozen Focke-Wulf 90s dove out of the sun, their cannons blazing, and the sky erupted into chaos. Charlie broke left and pulled hard, the G-forces pressing him into his seat as he tried to get position on one of the German fighters that was lining up on a bomber. His wingman stayed with him, the two Mustangs working together like they'd been trained, and Charlie got tone on the Focke-Wulf and squeezed the trigger, his 650 caliber machine guns roaring to life and sending a stream of tracers into the German plane. The FW-90 shuddered and rolled, smoke pouring from its engine, and fell away toward the earth far below. One down, but dozens more to go. The air battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, with fighters twisting and turning and dying all around. And through it all, the bombers kept flying, kept heading toward their target, because that was the mission and nothing else mattered. Charlie shot down another German fighter, a Messerschmitt 109 that made the mistake of crossing in front of him. And then his wingman called out a warning, and Charlie looked up and saw something that made his blood run cold. Jets. The new Messerschmitt 262s, the fastest fighters in the world, capable of speeds over 500 miles per hour, and there were at least 25 of them diving toward the bomber formation. The Me-262 was a revolutionary aircraft, powered by jet engines instead of propellers, and it could outrun and outclimb any Allied fighter in existence. It had one weakness. It wasn't very maneuverable at high speeds, which meant a skilled pilot in a slower plane could sometimes get a shot if he was brave enough or crazy enough to try. Charlie was both. He pushed his throttle full forward and dove toward the jets, knowing he was outmatched in speed, but hoping he could disrupt their attack run long enough for the bombers to get through. His Mustang screamed down through the sky, the engine howling and the airframe shaking, and he picked out one of the 262s and aimed for where it would be rather than where it was. The German pilot saw him coming and tried to evade, but Charlie had guessed right, and his burst of machine gun fire caught the jet's wing, tearing through the thin metal and causing the pilot to lose control. The Me-262 went into a spin and fell away, but there were still 24 more, and they were tearing into the bomber formation with their 30mm cannons that could rip a B-17 apart with just a few hits. Charlie saw one bomber explode in a fireball and another start to fall with its wing torn off, and he felt rage and frustration, but he kept fighting, kept flying, because that was all he could do. And then he had an idea, crazy and desperate, but maybe just crazy enough to work. He had noticed that the German jets were attacking in a specific pattern, coming in from high and behind, making one pass with their cannons, and then climbing back up to altitude to set up another attack. They were fast, but predictable, and if he could disrupt that pattern, confuse them, make them think there were more American fighters than there actually were, he might be able to buy the bombers enough time to reach the target and start their bomb run. Charlie got on the radio and called out to the other red tails in his flight, 4 Mustangs total, including his own, and he told them his plan. They would split up and each take a different position around the bomber formation, and every time a jet started its attack run, they would fire at it even if they were out of range, making the German pilots think they were flying into a hornet's nest of American fighters. The key was to make the Germans hesitate, make them abort their runs or change their approach, anything to slow them down and reduce the effectiveness of their attacks. It was a bluff, pure and simple. 4 American fighters trying to fool an entire Luftwaffe squadron into thinking they were outnumbered. The other pilots agreed, veterans, all of them, who understood the desperate times called for desperate measures, and they spread out around the bombers and waited. The next wave of Me-262s came in, and Charlie positioned his Mustang directly in their path, firing long bursts even though he knew he was too far away to hit anything. The tracers arced through the sky like fireworks, and the lead German jet broke off his attack, banking hard to avoid what he probably thought was a coordinated defensive screen. The other jets followed his lead, scattering and climbing back to altitude to reassess. Charlie grinned inside his oxygen mask, his heart pounding, and called out to his flight to do it again. For the next 20 minutes, the 4 red tails played a deadly game of cat and mouse with the German jets, constantly moving, constantly firing, making themselves as visible and threatening as possible. Every time a jet started an attack run, one of the Mustangs would appear in front of it, guns blazing, and force it to break off or risk a head-on collision. The German pilots were skilled and experienced, but they were also cautious, trained to survive rather than sacrifice themselves in suicide attacks. And Charlie's bluff worked better than he had any right to hope. The jets scored some hits on the bombers, downing a few and damaging others, but far fewer than they should have been able to with their superior speed and firepower. And then the bombers reached the target and began their run, opening their bomb bay doors and releasing thousands of pounds of high explosive on the factory below. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky, thick and deadly, but the formation held together and completed the drop, and then turned for home. Charlie and his flight stayed with them every mile of the way, still playing their dangerous game with the German jets, still bluffing and dodging and firing, until finally, mercifully, they crossed back out of German airspace and the Luftwaffe fighters broke off pursuit. The flight back to Italy was long and tense, with several damaged bombers struggling to stay in the air and everyone's fuel gauges creeping toward empty. Charlie's hands were shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion, his shoulder aching from the strain of manhandling the Mustang through hours of hard maneuvering. But he kept flying, kept leading his flight,
And when the Italian coast finally appeared on the horizon, he felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made him cry. They landed at Ramitelli Airfield as the sun was setting, taxiing in one by one. And as Charlie climbed out of his cockpit, his crew chief ran up to him with a huge grin and told him that the bomber crews were already on the radio singing the praises of the Red Tails who had saved their lives over Berlin.
Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the commander of the 332nd Fighter Group, met Charlie on the flight line and shook his hand, his eyes conveying pride and respect. Later that evening, Charlie learned that he and his fellow Red Tails had been credited with shooting down 3 Me-262 jets, including the one Charlie had hit, making them some of the first American pilots to defeat the German jets in combat. The intelligence officers wanted to know every detail of the engagement, how the jets attacked, how the Red Tails defended, and when Charlie described his bluffing tactic, using 4 fighters to simulate a much larger force, the officers looked at each other and nodded with something like awe. One of them said it was one of the most innovative tactical decisions he'd heard of, using psychology and misdirection instead of just firepower. But for Charlie, the real victory wasn't the medals or the commendations or even the confirmed kills, though those were nice. The real victory was the knowledge that he and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen had done their job, had protected the bombers, had proven once again that they were as good as any pilots in the world, regardless of the color of their skin. The 332nd Fighter Group would go on to fly hundreds more missions before the war ended, earning a reputation as one of the most effective escort units in the 8th Air Force, and their distinctive red tails became a symbol of excellence and courage. Bomber crews specifically requested red tail escorts because they knew those pilots would never abandon them, would never chase personal glory at the expense of the mission, would stick with them through hell and high water. The statistics bore out that reputation. During their time escorting bombers, the Red Tails had the lowest loss rate of any fighter group, with fewer bombers shot down on their watch than any other unit. But the road to that respect had been long and hard, paved with racism and discrimination and doubt. The Tuskegee Airmen had to be twice as good to be considered half as capable, had to prove themselves over and over again, while white pilots with half their skill were given the benefit of the doubt. They flew obsolete planes at first, P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks that couldn't compete with the latest German fighters, and only through superior training and skill did they survive. When they finally got P-51 Mustangs, the best fighter plane of the war, they made the most of it, racking up victory after victory and proving beyond any doubt that they belonged in the sky. Charlie Brantley would survive the war and return home to a country that was still deeply segregated, where black veterans were denied the GI Bill benefits that helped white veterans buy homes and go to college, where returning black servicemen were sometimes attacked or killed by racist mobs who resented their military service. But Charlie and his fellow Tuskegee Airmen carried themselves with dignity and pride, knowing what they had accomplished, knowing that they had helped win the war and had torn down at least some of the barriers of discrimination in the process. They opened doors for future generations of African American pilots and proved that skin color had nothing to do with courage or ability. Years later, when the Air Force was finally integrated in 1948, many of the Tuskegee Airmen continued to serve with distinction in Korea and Vietnam and beyond, becoming generals and test pilots and leaders in military aviation. Their legacy lived on not just in the history books, but in the example they set, showing excellence and determination could overcome even the most entrenched prejudice. The story of Code Red, of the Tuskegee Airmen who fooled an entire Luftwaffe squadron, is just one small piece of that larger legacy,
but it encapsulates everything the Red Tails stood for: innovation, courage, teamwork, and an absolute refusal to quit no matter the odds. Charlie Brantley didn't just fight the Germans that day over Berlin. He fought against every doubter who said black men couldn't be pilots, fought against a system that tried to keep him and men like him on the ground. And he won. Not just the battle, but the war, both the one against fascism and the one against racism at home. That's what makes his story and the story of all the Tuskegee Airmen so powerful and so important. They were warriors on multiple fronts, fighting for freedom abroad while being denied full freedom at home. And they did it with grace and skill and an unshakable belief in their own worth. The red tails they painted on their planes were more than just unit markings. They were a declaration of identity and pride, a visual reminder that these pilots were different from any who had come before, and that they would not be ignored or dismissed or relegated to second-class status. When bomber crews saw those red tails, they knew they were protected by the best, and that knowledge gave them the courage to keep flying into the most dangerous skies in the world. Charlie Brantley passed away many years after the war, an old man who had lived to see many of the changes he had fought for, though not all of them. He told his story to historians and students, making sure the legacy of the Tuskegee Airmen would not be forgotten. And he always emphasized that he was just one man among many, that the real heroes were all the pilots and ground crews and support personnel who made the 332nd Fighter Group what it was. But those who knew him, those who heard him speak, understood that his modesty was born from the same place as his courage, a deep sense of duty and service that transcended ego or personal recognition. He flew not for medals, but for his country and his fellow airmen. And that's what made him a true hero. The tale of Code Red, the Tuskegee Airmen who fooled an entire Luftwaffe squadron, is just one small piece of that larger legacy, but it encapsulates everything the Red Tails stood for: innovation, courage, teamwork, and an absolute refusal to quit no matter the odds. Charlie Brantley didn't just fight the Germans that day over Berlin. He fought against every doubter who said black men couldn't be pilots, fought against a system that tried to keep him and men like him on the ground. And he won. Not just the battle, but the war, both the one against fascism and the one against racism at home. That's what makes his story and the story of all the Tuskegee Airmen so powerful and so important.